In the summer of 1948, the most powerful woman in America was found dead in her bedroom. She had not been ill. There was no warning. Her own stepdaughter discovered her body in a country mansion outside Washington, D.C., in a house she had grown so afraid of living in alone that she kept loaded guns by her bed, in her car, and in her purse. She believed her own staff was spying on her. She believed someone wanted her dead. And when she finally died, some of her own family quietly wondered if she had been right. Her name was Eleanor Patterson. Almost everyone who knew her called her Cissy. She was the granddaughter of one newspaper dynasty, the sister of another publishing titan, and the cousin of a third. By 1943, she owned and personally ran the single most widely read newspaper in the nation's capital, at a time when almost no woman in America was permitted anywhere near that kind of power. Time magazine called her the most hated woman in America. Her own staff called her simply the lady. And President Franklin Roosevelt was so afraid of what she could do to him in print that he tried to have her indicted for espionage. She humiliated senators in public. She feuded with first ladies, with movie stars, with her own oldest friends. She published intimate secrets about Washington's most powerful families on her own front page, including, eventually, the secrets of her own daughter. That daughter would spend the final years of her mother's life calling her, in writing, a woman who hated herself and took it out on her child. And when Cissy Patterson finally died, that daughter discovered her mother had tried to write her out of one of the largest fortunes in American newspaper history. Tonight, we are going to find out how a kidnapped baby, a vengeful count, 2 presidents, a czar, a stolen love affair, and one of the most explosive newspaper wars in American history collided to create the woman the press once called too dangerous to ignore and too cruel to love. This is the story of Cissy Patterson, and it begins, like so many of these stories do, with a fortune she never had to earn, and a childhood that quietly destroyed her ability to trust anyone who claimed to love her. But before we go further, if stories like this matter to you, stories about women history got wrong, women whose full truth was never told, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week on Behind the Pearls, we open the locket on a woman the world reduced to a footnote. You do not want to miss what's coming. Now, back to Cissy. To understand Cissy Patterson, you first need to understand the family that made her possible, and the family that very nearly broke her before she ever printed a single word. Her grandfather was Joseph Medill. He helped nominate Abraham Lincoln for the presidency. He served as Chicago's first mayor after the Great Fire of 1871 rebuilt the city from ash. And he owned and ran the Chicago Tribune, transforming it into one of the most powerful newspapers in the Midwest. Ink did not just run in this family's blood. It was the family's entire identity. Medill's daughter, Eleanor, known to everyone as Nellie, married Robert Wilson Patterson, a man who rose from night telegraph operator to managing editor and eventually publisher of the Tribune itself. On paper, it should have been a fairy tale, a newspaper dynasty marrying into itself, generation after generation. In practice, it was a marriage built on cold ambition rather than warmth. Robert Patterson was, by multiple accounts, an unhappy and heavy-drinking man who would eventually take his own life. Nellie Patterson was a prominent socialite, but biographers describe her as a distant, status-obsessed mother, a woman who once declared that her children must associate with swells or nobody. Into this house, on November 7th, 1881, in Chicago, Illinois, a daughter was born. Her name was Eleanor Josephine Patterson. Her older brother nicknamed her Cissy. The name stuck for the rest of her life. Cissy grew up in a 91-room mansion on Chicago's Astor Street. She summered in Newport. She traveled extensively through Europe. By any material measure, her childhood was a fantasy of wealth. But material wealth and emotional safety are not the same thing. And Cissy Patterson would spend the rest of her life confusing the two. She was educated first at Miss Hersey's school in Boston, then at the elite Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut, graduating in 1901 in the very same classrooms that would later educate Jacqueline Kennedy. Of her parents, biographers note that Cissy found her father indulgent but absent, and her mother cold and socially calculating. The person she genuinely adored, by her own account, was her grandfather, Joseph Medill, the one figure in her early life who seemed to represent strength without cruelty. In 1900, Nellie Patterson decided that Chicago society was no longer enough. She wanted Washington. So she did what wealthy families of that era did when they wanted to announce their arrival. She commissioned the most fashionable architect in America. Stanford White, the celebrated New York architect behind some of the era's most lavish private residences, designed a gleaming white marble Beaux Arts mansion at 15 DuPont Circle. It was completed in 1903, and it remains to this day one of the last grand private mansions still standing on that historic circle. It was into this glittering new world of Washington high society that a young Cissy Patterson stepped, fresh from boarding school, about to become one of the most talked about young women in the capital. When Cissy visited her mother's new Washington home during school holidays, she fell in with two other young women of equally formidable pedigree. The first was Alice Roosevelt, the famously sharp-tongued and headstrong daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt. The second was Marguerite Cassini, who went by Maggie, officially listed as the ward, but in reality, the daughter of the Russian ambassador to the United States. The press, delighted by the trio of brilliant, wealthy, unmarried young women dominating every major social event in the capital, gave them a nickname that would follow all three for the rest of their lives: the Three Graces of Washington. For a time, the friendship between Cissy and Alice Roosevelt was genuine, but Washington society, then as now, ran on proximity, ambition, and long memories, and the two women would eventually become locked in one of the longest-running, most vicious social feuds the capital had ever seen. At 21 in 1901, Cissy was presented to European court society, traveling to Vienna to stay with her uncle, Robert McCormick, who had just been appointed United States ambassador to Austria-Hungary. It was there, amid the gilded halls of one of the last great empires of old Europe, that Cissy Patterson met the man who would nearly destroy her life before it had properly begun. His name was Count Joseph Giesecke. And almost everyone who has studied this story agrees on one thing. He was, by every conventional definition, a fortune hunter. He was Polish nobility, handsome, charming, and almost completely without money of his own. What he did have was a title, and in the social economy of early 20th century Europe and America, a title from an impoverished aristocrat could often be exchanged for an American heiress's bank account. Cissy fell for him anyway. Their courtship continued even after she returned home to Washington, D.C., to that new DuPont Circle mansion. Despite her family's vocal objections that would prove devastatingly accurate, Cissy married Count Gizicki in a lavish ceremony at that very mansion on April 14th, 1904. Her family had warned her. They were right to. After the wedding, Cissy traveled with her new husband to his ancestral estate in what was then Russian-controlled Poland, near the border village of Nowosilica. What she found there was nothing like the fairy tale castle she had imagined. The estate was, by her own later description, little more than a huge dilapidated barn. The windows had no curtains. The promised servants turned out to be unpaid peasant children, and the first thing she noticed, walking the grounds, was the number of local village children who bore an unmistakable resemblance to her new husband. The Count was, in her own words years later, a sensualist who lived only for wine, women, and his own pleasure. He drank heavily. He gambled compulsively. And according to multiple biographical accounts, he was violent, both toward the servants on his estate and eventually toward Cissy herself. He openly told her she was no good as a wife, that she bored him, and that he intended to send her back to America at the first opportunity. And yet, on September 3rd, 1905, in the middle of this collapsing marriage, Cissy gave birth to a daughter. They named her Felicia Leonora. By 1905, Cissy had endured enough. She fled the estate, taking her infant daughter, and made her way first to London, hiding in a quiet residence near the city. The Count followed her. And what happened next turned a private marital collapse into an international scandal that would dominate newspapers on 2 continents. Gizicki and several accomplices, disguised in heavy furs and driving goggles to conceal their identities, broke into the nursery where Felicia was being kept and physically abducted the child. They smuggled her out of England and into Austria, where she was hidden inside a remote convent. Newspaper headlines around the world ran a single, shocking phrase: "Count kidnaps baby." Overnight, Cissy Patterson, a young American woman who had married into European nobility largely out of naive infatuation, became one of the most talked about women on earth. The Count, through intermediaries, made his demand explicit. He wanted $1 million in exchange for the return of his own daughter. What followed was an 18-month diplomatic ordeal that genuinely involved 2 heads of state. President-elect William Howard Taft personally appealed to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, since the Count's estate fell under Russian jurisdiction, to intervene. The Tsar ordered his police to act. Count Gizicki was briefly jailed upon his return to his Russian estate, and, by most accounts, never contacted Cissy or his daughter again for the rest of his life. In August 1909, after nearly 2 years of separation, Cissy Patterson returned to the United States with her daughter Felicia, finally back in her arms. She had won. But it would take her another 8 years, until 1917, to finally secure a legal divorce. And the experience left a mark on her that would shape every relationship she had for the rest of her life, including, tragically, the relationship with the very daughter she had fought so hard to recover. For more than a decade after returning from Europe, Cissy Patterson lived the kind of life available to a wealthy, beautiful, socially connected divorcee with no particular ambition beyond her own circle. She moved briefly to Lake Forest, Illinois, then returned permanently to Washington, D.C. in 1913. She also purchased a working cattle ranch near Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a place she genuinely loved and returned to for the rest of her life. She became an accomplished horsewoman there, and her love of horses, and of animals generally, never left her. But it was Washington that remained her real stage. And Washington was where her old friendship with Alice Roosevelt, By now, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, married to the powerful Speaker of the House Nicholas Longworth, finally and spectacularly imploded. At a dinner party hosted by the Longworths themselves, Alice reportedly walked in on Cissy and her own husband Nicholas together in an upstairs bathroom, the light on, the door unlocked. Whatever the full truth of that evening, Alice did not let it go quietly. She began, and sustained for years, her own affair with a powerful sitting United States Senator, William Edgar Borah of Idaho. The detail that made the whole Capitol take notice was this: Cissy Patterson had also, at one point, been involved with the very same Senator Borah. Alice, by every account, won that particular contest. The affair between Alice and Borah eventually produced a daughter, Paulina, whose true paternity was one of Washington's most persistent open secrets for decades. The friendship between Cissy and Alice never recovered. It curdled instead into one of the longest, bitterest, and most entertaining rivalries in the history of Washington society, one that would eventually spill directly onto the printed page. During this restless decade, Cissy discovered an unexpected talent: writing. In 1920, her brother Joseph finally relented to years of her pleading and allowed her to write for his newly founded paper, the New York Daily News. She also began working, in a smaller capacity, for William Randolph Hearst himself. Under the name Eleanor M. Gazicka, she published 2 Romans Clef, thinly fictionalized novels that savagely satirized Washington's elite, including unmistakable, recognizable portraits of her own friends and enemies. Glass Houses in 1926 and Fall Flight in 1928. Both novels, biographers agree, were at least partly fueled by her ongoing feud with Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She had, without quite realizing it yet, found the one tool that would define the rest of her life: the printed word, used as a weapon. In 1925, she married again, this time to Elmer Schlesinger, a Harvard-educated corporate lawyer and heir to a Chicago department store fortune. It appeared, on the surface, to be a stable, comfortable match between 2 people of substantial independent means. Then, in 1930, after only 4 years of marriage, Elmer Schlesinger died suddenly of a heart attack. Cissy was widowed for the second time. She was 48 years old, independently wealthy beyond most people's imagination, twice married, once kidnapped from within her own marriage, and entirely without direction. That was about to change completely. In 1930, William Randolph Hearst, the single most powerful newspaper publisher in America, owned 2 newspapers in Washington, D.C. Both of them were losing money. Badly, the Washington Herald ran 4th out of 5 daily papers in the capital. It had been hemorrhaging money for years. Hearst, despite controlling one of the largest media empires on the planet, could not turn it around. Cissy Patterson had no formal journalism leadership experience. She had never run a business in her life. What she had was a famous newspaper surname, a friendship with Hearst's most trusted columnist, Arthur Brisbane, and, crucially, absolutely nothing left to lose. Brisbane convinced Hearst to take a chance on her. In 1930, Cissy Patterson walked into the Washington Herald as its new editor. That same year, following Elmer Schlesinger's death, she had legally changed her name to Mrs. Eleanor Medill Patterson. She had, in her own words, grown up with circulation and advertising as her first words. It turned out to be true in practice, not just in family mythology. Cissy Patterson was, by every account from people who worked for her, an utterly unconventional newsroom presence. She would arrive at the office in a chauffeured limousine, often in full riding costume, fresh from horseback, or occasionally in formal evening clothes from the night before. She traveled with a fleet of poodles who frequently accompanied her into the building and lived with her at her DuPont Circle home. And underneath the eccentricity was something almost nobody had predicted: genuine editorial instinct. She immediately began adding local features and local color, rejecting the generic wire service content the paper had relied on for years. She hired women reporters at a moment when almost no major American daily employed them in meaningful numbers, including the celebrated journalist Adela Rogers St. John's and reporter Martha Blair, both of whom became significant figures in their own right. She insisted on the best possible writing, layout, typography, comics, and imagery, treating every section of the paper, including the women's pages, with the same seriousness traditionally reserved for front-page political coverage. By 1936, the Herald's circulation had doubled to 120,000 readers. Hearst himself had been unable to accomplish that. A woman with no prior journalism leadership experience had done it within 6 years. In 1936, she became one of the first women ever invited to join the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Her DuPont Circle mansion, meanwhile, had become something close to a second seat of government. In the summer of 1927, while the actual White House underwent extensive repairs, 15 DuPont Circle served as the temporary residence of President and Mrs. Calvin Coolidge. It was there, in Cissy Patterson's own home, that the Coolidges hosted aviator Charles Lindbergh in the wake of his historic transatlantic flight, one of the most celebrated moments in the history of American aviation. By her late 40s, Cissy Patterson was no longer simply a wealthy divorcee with a complicated past. She was becoming one of the genuine power brokers of the American capital, in a city where she had once been known mainly as one-third of a glamorous teenage trio. By 1937, Hearst's broader financial empire was crumbling under enormous debt. He was forced to lease both the Herald and his evening paper, the Washington Times, to Patterson rather than risk losing them outright. In January 1939, Cissy Patterson did something almost no woman in America had ever done. She purchased both papers from Hearst outright, then made a bold and controversial decision. Rather than running two competing publications, she merged them into a single, round-the-clock newspaper publishing 10 editions within every 24-hour cycle. She called it the Washington Times-Herald. By 1943, it was the most widely read newspaper in the nation's capital. And, remarkably, it was profitable, something neither of its previous incarnations under Hearst had ever managed to be. At the height of her power, Cissy Patterson owned 6 separate residences across Maryland, Florida, New York, and beyond. Her combined personal and business staff numbered roughly 1,300 employees. She had transformed herself, in little more than a decade, from a directionless, twice-widowed socialite into one of the most powerful media figures in the United States, male or female. Power, in Cissy Patterson's hands, was never going to be quiet. She used her newspaper as a personal weapon against everyone who crossed her, and a remarkable number of extremely powerful people crossed her, or were crossed by her, throughout the 1930s and 1940s. She feuded publicly and viciously with gossip columnist Walter Winchell, mocking his background in print. She derided Henry Luce's wife, the playwright and Congresswoman Claire Booth Luce, as that lovely asp, a line so cutting that Luce's own husband, the owner of Time and Life magazines, began referring to Cissy's newspaper contemptuously as Cissy's henhouse. She called Vice President Henry Wallace a crystal-gazing crackpot in print, A 1946 profile in Collier's Weekly attempted to capture, in a single sentence, exactly what Cissy Patterson had become. Probably the most powerful woman in America, the magazine wrote, and perhaps the most hated. And in the years leading up to America's entry into the Second World War, she made an enemy more dangerous than any columnist or vice president. She made an enemy of the President of the United States. Alongside her brother Joseph Patterson, publisher of the New York Daily News, and her cousin Colonel Robert McCormick, publisher of the Chicago Tribune, Cissy became one of the most prominent voices of American isolationism in the years leading into the war. It had not always been this way. Through most of the 1930s, Cissy had actually been broadly supportive of Roosevelt and his New Deal policies, and her personal friendship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt had, for years, been genuinely close. Her own paper, alongside her brother's Daily News, had endorsed Roosevelt for an unprecedented third term in 1940. But by early 1941, both Cissy and Joseph had turned sharply against Roosevelt's foreign policy, fearing he was steadily, needlessly drawing the United States into a war on foreign soil. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had a name for the three Patterson and McCormick cousins together. He called them the Three Furies of Isolationism. And according to Cissy's biographer Ralph G. Martin, Roosevelt could easily have brought both Pattersons over to his cause through warmth and inclusion. Instead, his hostility created two bitter, powerful, lifelong enemies. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, both Cissy and her brother immediately offered their full support to the war effort. Roosevelt rebuffed the gesture, warning Cissy through intermediaries that she needed, in his words, to behave herself. Roosevelt biographer accounts describe his fury as something close to obsessive. He pushed his own Attorney General, Francis Biddle, to intensify federal investigations specifically targeting what insiders called the McCormick-Patterson axis. And then, in the summer of 1942, Cissy Patterson did something that nearly got her newspaper prosecuted for espionage. Following the American naval victory at the Battle of Midway, one of the most pivotal turning points of the entire Pacific War, the Chicago Tribune ran a detailed story revealing that American intelligence had advanced knowledge of Japanese fleet movements. Patterson's Times-Herald reprinted it. The story never explicitly stated that American codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval communications, but for anyone reading closely, including potentially Japanese intelligence officers, the implication was unmistakable. President Roosevelt was reportedly livid. He pushed for the Chicago Tribune and Cissy Patterson's Times-Herald to be formally indicted for espionage, a charge that could have meant the complete destruction of both newspapers and possible criminal prosecution. The charges were ultimately dropped. The Navy's own wartime censors had cleared the story for publication twice before it ran, and prosecutors recognized that pursuing the case risked making Roosevelt look like he was persecuting his political enemies rather than protecting national security, with a real likelihood that any jury would acquit. An unrepentant Cissy, asked about the entire affair afterward, simply snarled, "Do you think he arranged this?" Cissy Patterson had stared down a sitting wartime president of the United States, and the president had blinked first. But the controversy surrounding her politics, combined with persistent accusations that she and her brother harbored open sympathy for Hitler's regime, would follow her reputation for the rest of her life. A member of the House of Representatives, Elmer Holland of Pennsylvania, stated on the floor of Congress that Cissy and her brother would welcome the victory of Hitler. She had become, by the early 1940s, simultaneously one of the most powerful and most reviled figures in American public life. And while all of this was happening in public, something far darker was unfolding in private. Cissy Patterson fought a czar and a president to get her daughter back. And then she spent the rest of that daughter's childhood unable to give her the one thing she had fought so hard to win the right to provide: real love. Felicia Gazika grew up shuttled between her mother's many residences. Fluent in French, German, and Russian by adolescence, the direct legacy of her unusual, fractured early childhood. By her teenage years, she was, by every biographical account, every bit as dramatic and willful as her mother had been at the same age. At 18 in 1924, Felicia ran away from the family's Wyoming ranch following a violent argument with her mother. One biographer describes it as a knockdown, drag-out fight that included hair-pulling and torn clothing. Felicia rode out alone, withdrew money from her own account, and traveled first to Salt Lake City, then on to San Diego, where she lived undetected for 4 months, working as a waitress under an assumed identity. A daughter so desperate to escape her mother's house that she chose anonymous poverty over staying. In 1925, Felicia married a young, ambitious journalist named Drew Pearson, a man who would go on to become one of the most influential investigative, muckraking columnists in 20th century American journalism. They had a daughter together, Ellen. The marriage ended in divorce just a few years later. Cissy's relationship with her former son-in-law remained complicated for the rest of her life, alternating between professional collaboration, when she syndicated his column, and bitter public hostility, when she fired him over political disagreements and began attacking him in print as a muckraker. Felicia would later put into words with devastating clarity exactly what it felt like to be Cissy Patterson's daughter. She said her mother loved her, but could not show it. She said her mother hated herself, and that the hatred came out sideways, directed at the one person closest to her. The fights between mother and daughter were not occasional. They were constant, frequently fueled by alcohol on both sides, and increasingly vicious as the years passed. In 1943, after one final drunken confrontation at the dinner table, Felicia made a decision that shocked even people who knew the family well. She publicly announced, in writing, that she was divorcing her own mother. She reportedly opened her final words to Cissy with a curse so severe that even decades later, biographers quote it directly: she told her mother to go to hell. Cissy's reply, recorded by witnesses, was characteristically cold and dismissive. She simply told her daughter she was too fat. After that night, mother and daughter had almost no contact for years. The estrangement was nearly total. Cissy Patterson was, by multiple accounts from people who knew her in her final years, a woman who treated her own last will and testament as a weapon to be sharpened and resharpened against the people who had disappointed her. Biographers describe her habit of constantly rewriting it as something close to a personal hobby, rewarding whoever currently stood in her favor, and cutting out whoever had most recently fallen from it. In 1924, when relations with Felicia were still warm, Cissy's will had named her daughter as the sole heir to everything, an estate that would eventually be worth somewhere in the range of $16 million, equivalent to well over $150 million today. By 1946, after years of escalating hostility, Cissy rewrote that will entirely. She reportedly told her own chauffeur, with what witnesses described as grim satisfaction, "They'll have a damned good fight when I'm gone. I've fixed that." Under the final version of her will, Felicia was left only the family's Long Island estate, properties in North Dakota, household furnishings, her mother's wardrobe, jewelry, and paintings, along with a tax-free annual allowance of $25,000 that Cissy herself described in writing as being provided simply to keep her off the streets. The newspaper that had made the family's modern fortune, the Washington Times-Herald itself, was left not to Felicia, but to 7 of Cissy's own loyal executives, a group that newspapers of the day would later nickname, with a certain bitter irony, the 7 Dwarves. Neither Patterson House on DuPont Circle nor the Dower House estate went to Felicia either. The DuPont Circle mansion itself would eventually be donated to the American Red Cross. And in one particularly cruel detail recorded by biographer Amanda Smith, Cissy once mused aloud, in front of witnesses, that she might leave her Maryland country estate to Louvi, the second wife of Felicia's ex-husband, Drew Pearson. The woman who had effectively replaced her own daughter in the family that had once been Felicia's. By the mid-1940s, Cissy Patterson's personal life had collapsed almost entirely, even as her newspaper remained one of the most influential publications in Washington. Her brother Joseph, the closest sibling relationship she had, died in 1946. The loss devastated her and triggered a bitter power struggle with their cousin Bertie McCormick over control of the family's broader newspaper holdings. Her daughter had publicly disowned her. Her closest friendships, including her decades-long rivalry with Alice Roosevelt Longworth, had curdled into feuds over what witnesses described as increasingly trivial matters. She no longer made her once daily appearances in her own newsroom. And, according to multiple biographical accounts, she became genuinely afraid. She grew suspicious of her own household staff, convinced they were spying on her. She began keeping loaded guns by her bedside, in her car, and in her purse. Friends who knew her in this period described a woman who had become, in their words, drug-addled and drinking heavily, frequently approaching people at parties to tell them, in all apparent seriousness, that she intended to leave them her newspaper, and that if she were ever bumped off or murdered, they should know exactly who to suspect. The names she gave them, more than once, according to people who were present, was her own cousin, Colonel Robert McCormick. On July 24, 1948, Cissy Patterson's stepdaughter, Hallie Schlesinger, made the discovery. Cissy was dead in her bedroom. At her Dower House estate near Marlborough, Maryland, she was 66 years old. Newspapers at the time reported that the fiery publisher had died peacefully in her sleep. The official cause given was a heart attack, though competing contemporary accounts also attributed it, more broadly, to the cumulative effects of years of heavy alcohol use. She had not been reported ill. Her death came suddenly, with no warning given to her staff or family, and almost immediately, speculation began. Some within her own family quietly wondered whether her paranoid warnings about Colonel McCormick had been more than the ramblings of a frightened, intoxicated woman. Biographer Amanda Smith later noted a striking detail. When Colonel McCormick received the telephone call informing him that Cissy Patterson had died, his second wife recorded that his immediate, unexplained reaction was to begin softly singing a little song to himself. McCormick had a notably convenient alibi. He was in Paris at the time of her death. No formal accusation was ever made. No investigation concluded anything other than natural causes. But the fact that the question was even seriously whispered among people who actually knew Cissy Patterson tells you almost everything you need to know about the climate of fear, suspicion, and unresolved hostility she had built around herself by the end of her life. Felicia, despite the public estrangement, had apparently still expected to inherit the bulk of her mother's enormous estate. When she discovered the terms of the 1946 will, she filed a formal legal contest. Her former husband, Drew Pearson, despite their divorce years earlier, financed and helped organize her legal fight. His motivation was not entirely altruistic. Their daughter Ellen stood to inherit nothing at all if Felicia's claim failed. The case dragged through the press for months, generating exactly the kind of scandalous headlines Cissy Patterson had spent her entire career producing about other people. In the end, Felicia dropped her suit after receiving what one biographer called a modest settlement, a lump sum payment of $400,000, tax-free, equivalent to roughly $5 million today. It was, by any ordinary measure, a fortune. But it was a fraction of the $16 million estate her mother had once promised her, back when Felicia had still been, in her mother's own words, her beloved daughter. The 7 dwarves who inherited the Washington Times-Herald could not run it the way Cissy had. Neither, in the end, could Colonel Robert McCormick, the very man some of her family had quietly suspected of wanting her dead when he purchased the paper from them a year later. McCormick held on to the Times-Herald for 5 years, watching it slowly bleed money, before finally selling it to Eugene Meyer, owner of the rival Washington Post. Meyer absorbed the paper into his own, briefly publishing it under the combined name The Washington Post and Times-Herald, before eventually dropping the Patterson name from the masthead entirely. The newspaper Cissy Patterson had personally built from a failing 4th-place daily into the most widely read paper in the nation's capital did not survive long past her own death. And in one of history's quieter ironies, it would be Eugene Meyer's own daughter, Katharine Graham, who went on to become one of the most powerful newspaper publishers in American history. Continuing. Whether she ever fully acknowledged it or not, the very path Cissy Patterson had first cut for women in that industry. For decades, the story told about Cissy Patterson has been the story of a villain, a cruel, reckless, possibly fascist sympathizing woman who used enormous power carelessly and treated her own daughter with casual contempt. That story is not entirely wrong. She said genuinely indefensible things. She held political views, including early sympathy toward the Nazi regime that she only abandoned after seeing documented evidence of the concentration camps, at which point witnesses recorded that she broke down in tears. She inflicted real, lasting damage on the people closest to her, especially her own daughter. But that story, told alone, leaves out something essential. Cissy Patterson was kidnapped, in effect, twice. Once as a young bride trapped in an abusive marriage on a remote foreign estate, and once again when her own infant daughter was physically stolen from her by the man who was supposed to protect them both. She fought a czar and a future president to get that daughter back. And then, having grown up with a mother who taught her that love was conditional on status and behavior, she had no functional template for raising a daughter any differently than she herself had been raised. She became, by any honest measure, one of the most powerful women in 20th century American media, at a time when the very idea of a female newspaper publisher was considered, by most of the industry, to be close to a contradiction in terms. She built circulation no man before her had managed. She hired and promoted women journalists when almost no other publisher would. She was also, by the end, a woman so afraid and so alone that she slept with a loaded gun beside her bed, in a house she no longer felt safe inside, estranged from the one person who might have actually mourned her honestly instead of fighting over what she left behind. A Columbia Journalism Review retrospective once posed an unflinching question about her entire career. If the public good of her life had been weighed at age 50, the reviewer wrote, it might not have been substantial. It is a harsh judgment, and not an unfair one, but it is also not the whole story. History remembers her as a feared and feared of woman. We think the fuller truth is something closer to this. She was a woman who survived genuine trauma early in her life, and who, lacking any model for processing it, spent the rest of her life inflicting smaller versions of that same trauma on everyone closest to her, even as she built something genuinely remarkable in the world outside her own front door. Cissy Patterson once said she would rather raise hell than raise vegetables. It is one of the most quoted lines of her entire life, and it has always been told as a joke, proof of her wit, her fearlessness, her refusal to be tamed by anyone's expectations of what a woman of her era was supposed to be. But there is a second way to hear that line. A woman who never learned how to grow something patient and lasting, who only ever knew how to create noise, conflict, and spectacle, because nobody ever showed her what tending to something gentle actually looked like. She built an empire out of a failing newspaper nobody else could save. She faced down a sitting president of the United States and did not blink. She survived a kidnapping, a foreign court, and a divorce that took 13 years to finalize. And she died afraid, in a house full of guns she had placed there herself, estranged from the only child she had ever fought a czar to bring home. History calls her the most powerful woman in America and the most hated. We think both of those labels missed the only part of her story that actually mattered. She never figured out how to feel safe. Not with her husband, not with her power, not even, in the end, inside her own house. That is what Behind the Pearls is for. Every week, we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a single line. We find out what was really inside. If this story moved you, if you believe women like Cissy deserve their full, complicated truth told, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The next pearl is already waiting, and her story is just as extraordinary. I will see you there.